Welcome back to another video lecture for AP World History. Last time around we talked about the establishment of maritime empires. Today we're going to talk about the reactions to maritime empires. So I think we need to start off here. During the time of maritime empires, we have this theme of centralized states. What does that mean? So ever since we moved from hunters and gatherers into sedentary societies, now into empires, empires are what we call centralized states, meaning that authority was becoming more and more set together into a central area meant to manage large areas of land that were being conquered. The problem with this is, how do you deal with the people who you conquered, the minorities in the area? And again, by minorities, what I'm talking about here are religious minorities, language minorities, and ethnic minorities. So we talked last time around about the gunpowder empires. The Ottomans used the system of tolerance, in which they had multiple levels, especially their tolerance of millets, or local communities that ran themselves. The Safavids, who assimilated, everybody got forced into being Shiite within the Safavid Empire. And the Mughals, who attempted for a short period of time to blend together under Akbar, to blend together Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions in the areas like Christianity. Well, now the question is, how did people respond to all of this? Like, what do we see as the patterns? And there are three big patterns I want to bring up in this video lecture. One is work within the system. So one of the ways for minorities was basically to find a way to work within the system that was created in order to basically gain some freedom and to gain some area for them to have power. Another one was violent independence. Find a way to respond back to this, maintain independence, maintain traditions, whether it's through resistance or through rebellions or war. And then there's a third one that kind of doesn't fit in a way, because it has to do with slavery at this time. And the reason why it doesn't fit is that slavery was being redefined through the system of mercantilism and the issue of race. Okay, let's start off with work within the system. The very first one that I want to mention is the Fronde. The Fronde took place within France. What happened in the Fronde sort of revolution was that the Fronde revolution was not really a revolution, it was working within the system. How did it do this? So France had been fighting with Spain over the religious wars for 30 years. And because of that, it raised a lot of taxes. At that point, France really had to centralize and had to deal with how they were going to fight against Spain. One of their ministers, a man named Mazarin, tried to implement taxes on most of the local people, especially the nobles. And this led to a rebellion from the nobles, who were upset at this centralized power. But the rebellion was not so much a violent revolution, it was basically a way to limit the power of Mazarin and to try to have more and more influence. You might notice that this is getting us to the point eventually where we're going to eventually see things like voting and the need for representation and the need for a parliament. Another example is sort of like fighting within the system comes from Africa and Anna Nzinga's resistance. So Anna Nzinga within Africa was fighting against the Portuguese. And at one point, just to give you an example, Nzinga was really adept at fighting against the Portuguese by using their own tricks. So for example, at one point, Portuguese met with Nzinga, and they intentionally, when they met with her, they only put one chair in the room so that the Portuguese ambassador would be able to sit, and Nzinga would have no place to sit. Why would you do something like this? It was a symbolic way of demonstrating they had power over Nzinga. Well, Nzinga responded. The way she did this was to turn to one of her servants and say, okay, I just need you to kneel on the floor. You're going to act as my chair. Now, when you think about that, here's what she's doing, and again, fighting within the system. Nzinga is basically using the Portuguese against themselves. The Portuguese basically were saying, Nzinga, we're not going to give you a chair, you're not equal to us, and you're kind of not smart enough to be equal to us. So she finds a creative way to be equal to them by having one of her servants act as a chair. That also gives her power, because it demonstrates that she has her own hierarchy. And then after that, she utilized alliances with other Europeans, like the Dutch, to hold off the Portuguese. Again, working within the system. However, that was just one way. Another way was through maintaining independence through actual violent resistance. For example, in the Southwest in America, there were a group of people called the Pueblo. And after the Aztecs had been conquered, they were put on encomiendas. At one point, there was a leader amongst the Pueblo called Pope, and Pope led the native groups, and they were able to kick out the Spaniards. Pope then promised the local natives that the gods would reward them for having done this. Now, unfortunately, that's not what happened. There was a drought at the time which continued. The people there were suffering, and so they eventually, we think, we're not sure, but we think they deposed Pope. And after that, eventually the French, who were in the Mississippi region, posed kind of a threat to both the Spaniards and to the local natives. And so the Spaniards were eventually able to return. I'll give you another example of sort of like violent resistance. This took place in India. So in India, you might remember Aurangzeb, who came after Akbar. He not only tried to impose Islam on India, but remember Aurangzeb and Akbar were in the north. So he then tried to conquer all of India, and he went into what's called the Deccan South. Well, in the Deccan South, there were a group of confederation of different kingdoms called the Marathas. And the Marathas joined together, and they were able to stop Aurangzeb over 27 years. They were able to stop him from coming in and conquering. Eventually Aurangzeb died, and the Marathas were able to maintain their independence in the south. Give you another example of sort of violent revolution. Violent revolution took place in this case in North America. So in North America, in this case, we had the English who had conquered and colonized the 13 colonies there. And up in the northern part of that, there were a group of Indians called the Wampanoags. The Wampanoags were led by a man named King Philip, or Metacon, who was the son of Massasoit. He led a confederation of natives, including the Wampanoags, the Nipmucs, and the Narragansetts. The English had their own Indian allies, the Mohegans and the Mohawks. Now, at one point, King Philip's brother Alexander had been captured by the English, and while he was captured, he got a disease and he eventually died. The natives believed he had been poisoned by the English, and on top of that too, they were not happy about the fact that the colonists were expanding out into their land in the Ohio River Valley, and so the natives at that point fought against this. And when they fought against this, it went on for several years. By the end of this, 2,000 natives died, 1,000 were taken into slavery. The expansion of the English actually stopped for 50 years after this, so there was some success for the natives in stopping them. But eventually King Philip was captured and killed, and on top of that too, eventually the English would be able to expand out into the Ohio River Valley. Okay, one more example of violent revolutions that took place here was the Cossack Rebellion. So there, it's in Russia. Russia was expanding at the time. It's called the Tsarist Muscovy. And as they expanded outwards, they tried to bring in numerous people. It's kind of similar to the United States expanding and dealing with natives. In Russian area, there were a lot of nomadic groups and farming groups. One of them was the Cossacks. The Cossacks lived in the Polish-Lithuanian region. They oftentimes did raids on local areas, like for example against the Ottoman Empire. The Tsarist Muscovy brought them into the Russian Empire. The Cossacks tried to rebel against this, but eventually they were forced into the Russian Empire. Okay, so those are a few different examples of people who maintained or tried to maintain independence through violence. Then last off is African slavery. So Africans who were taken into slavery were really kind of in a very strange space. One, they were taken into slavery over 3 different continents. That does not allow for a lot of areas for them to be able to somehow escape outwards. On top of that too, they were racially being defined as being property. And so because of that, they and their ancestors would be maintained as property. So how do you deal with something like this? Well, some Africans, the way they dealt with it was to escape to areas where there wasn't as much control by the empires. For example, there were what were called the Maroon colonies. The Maroon colonies could be found in the Caribbean, and they were also found in Florida, where African slaves would escape out to Native American regions where they were hidden out from the dominant empires. Now, to be quite honest, this only worked for so long, only because as the empires gained more and more control over mercantilism, they would eventually conquer these areas and bring these African slaves back in. Okay, so what are our takeaways from these resistance movements? One, very important. I need you to remember this is about centralized empires trying to expand outwards, and as they did that, they would unify and then they would standardize. In other words, they tried to bring minorities in and force them into one system. Because of that, we see reactions from minority groups, and they come in a variety of ways, not just violence. Play within the system, maintain your identity, escape to areas where the empires don't have control. And last off, I want us to consider slavery. African slavery really is in many ways a unique system. It's a unique system because of the economics of mercantilism, and it's a unique system because of the issue of race, which is going to lead us into a global issue of identity. Okay, thanks a lot. See you in class.